Trials and Tribulations, where we break down the latest FDA revelations. DAPs, that's the talk of the day. Diversity action plans paving the way. Diversity of trials, that's what we preach. Inclusivity for all, it's within our reach. FDA's draft, we're breaking it down. All diversity trials, the best part around. FDA, please, we need the shift. Diversity in trials, let's uplift. DAP, yeah, you know me. Inclusivity for all, it's the key. Diversity in trials, that's what we preach. Inclusivity for all, it's within our reach. FDA's draft, we're breaking it down. All diversity trials, the best part around. So tune in live and join the ride. DiversiTrials and Tribulations, let's spread it wide. With DAPs, we're forging the path. Together in research, let's make it last. Diversity of trials, that's what we preach. Inclusivity for all, it's within our reach. FDA's draft, we're breaking it down. All diversity trials, the best part around.
Hey,
DiversiTrials, the best part around. Yes,
right?
please.
We're gonna pass number 7. Who's that guy?
Hey, we did it, everyone.
We did it actually. We didn't say.
I know we actually matched this week. Nice.
You got it.
With different.
We got
styles,
DiversiBuddy on Hottie, sporting the blue, and an awesome hairdo. That rhymed. And then you got the old school, not old school, but nice DiversiTrial right there. Welcome everyone to DiversiTrials and Tribulations, the podcast dedicated to doing a deep dive into the FDA's Diversity Action Plan draft guidance. This gives you, the community, an opportunity to talk about this guidance, give you a microphone so we can get this to the FDA so that they know that there are some very passionate people who want to talk about this and make things better for our industry. I said it before. I'll say it again. I'll say it in blue in the face. This is super duper important. Do not give up this opportunity to speak up. This is the time to do it. So,
That's right.
That said, the link to our shared PDF document, you can get in, add comments at any time. That is in YouTube and on LinkedIn. So if you check out the LinkedIn event or the YouTube, that you should be able to see the link to the PDF. Hop in, add your comments.
Yep. Start with a really quick review of the SWOT analysis from section 5A, a very beefy section, one that we all love to talk about. It's one of our favorites. Do we want to mix this up? Who wants to take strengths this time?
I even matched the SWOT today. Nice.
Yeah, you do. You're SWOTiflaged.
Yeah, I'll take strengths today. So, in general, what we felt from at least this section, there's relatively some solid quality. I didn't have too many strengths to throw on this one and the previous one, so I'm glad this one filled up quite a bit. But yeah, written with enough foresight and pretty proactive guidance designed to be functional after underserved populations are included in clinical trials. We did feel that there was a lot of similarities, which makes it good with like DSMB boards. So there's a lot of similarities to how the parameters are structured, which is nice because you have that familiarity with the processes. 227 to 294, big chunk of section right there. The expectations and procedures designed to set enrollment goals, including secondary processes, seem to be clearly defined and explained, which is nice. 256, 257, In events with little to no data available, such as rare disease, which is something we've talked about pretty heavily, I think, in the previous sections as well. They do a good job at acknowledging that and acknowledging the challenges with setting goals where it might be difficult to find the information you need to create such goals. So they acknowledge hypothesis-driven opportunities for further studies. 316 sponsors FDA about DAPS engage early in development. So, you know, it's again almost another one of those like contradictory points, because there's a lot where they don't necessarily include it or require it, but it's again that constant encouragement to encourage sponsors to engage the FDA as early in the clinical development stage as possible. And then they also clarified that DAPS may be used for multiple studies across a program, which, you know, ideally should be able to help save costs and help establish standards. Bumping it over.
Hey, Hadi, do you want to do?
Yeah, weaknesses. Yeah, I'll take over the weaknesses section, but I see them a little bit linked to the opportunities as well. So because we can turn the weaknesses or challenges into opportunities, and that's what we're doing right now. So the biggest thing for us, and we've discussed this already, and for me personally, is that the lack of specificity when it comes to Directive 15 of the Office of Management and Budget, recognizing MENA, the Middle Eastern and North Africa, as a new, separate, and unique category, demographic category on its own, which will be reflected in the US Census 2030. So that, I mean, in our opinion, collectively, this should be clarified as a standalone, section maybe, or at least paragraph within this section. Now, we talked about the lack of clarity or proper representation of the tables. We even suggested inclusion of other tables whereby we can put requirements versus, recommendations. Last week, we also talked about the lack of clarity in terms of how the FDA will deal or review these action plans and how this is going to be evolved in terms of are they going to keep us informed or on how this process is going to shape up, or how is it going to end up being, or is it going to be like they're going to receive those feedback announcements or posts or suggestions and then just turn it out and just like provide the final guidance. So we're not clear in regards to what's going to happen next. Mainly what I got from the weaknesses, there is also the ethical consideration regarding the public versus private data for demographic assessment. This section was not really clear to us as well. So that's basically some clarity. So we're asking for more clarity, more organization around the presentation of the tables and the data.
Very nice. And I'll take on opportunities here. So the first opportunity is maybe include OMB's Federal Register number 15 as a footnote and or reference for the MENA population in addition to the U.S. Census approved demographic categories. Mitch, I took your advice. I read footnote number 46, and guess what the main headliner of that entire guidance was? Federal Register number 15 in January 2024, before the updates. That's still a draft guidance. So I hope that they can come back and fix that and add MENA into there.
Correct.
We need to create a table with clear communication of requirements versus recommendations. That was a little bit of a confusing part. We weren't sure what was what, need a little more clarity. Revise table 1 to be helpful, possibly by adding more granular demographics and or social determinants of health. We need to elucidate the life cycle of a diversity action plan, its relevance, and how it might evolve and change from phase 1 through 4. So I wish that what they included in section C was there for that discussion, because I think that answers our question, actually. We need to clarify how FDA will review and receive DApps from global regulatory agencies. There's a lot of not sure what's going to happen here. We know the FDA's purview versus how we're going to engage in the globe. There's nothing in the guidance that talks about how we're going to address this globally. And I think that's a really, really good point. And finally, we need to eliminate a footnote of a footnote and simply cite the original footnote.
Right.
I get it. You don't have to turn pages, but it's still not great. So,
Yeah.
Mitch, want to take on the threat?
Yeah, as we jump into finalizing the threats, another thought, that I had, and we kind of discussed a little bit as a team too, is it's not only like the footnotes to footnotes, but what we found to that point of when we talked about Directive 15, footnote 46 takes you to the collection of race and ethnicity data in clinical trials and clinical studies for FDA regulated medical products. There was another footnote that directed you to the evaluation and reporting of age, race, and ethnicity specific data in medical device clinical studies. So there's a lot of overlap in a lot of the different guidance, some that's already in draft form, some that's been finalized. And I think in general, that's another weakness or almost threat, because, you have a lot of like reference to certain documents or certain guidance, but then you don't necessarily end up with one piece of
so impartial, like
right. So anytime you come up with a new document, and we all know that it's not a swift process. I mean, just from draft guidelines to when they accept comments, it's a 90-day period. So you're already eating in like 3 months right there, a whole quarter. And then you have additional like 60 days from when guidance is like published to go into effect and all kinds of other stuff. It's a lengthy process, but every time that you come out with these new updates, like there's the Directive 15 from the OMB, this new draft DAP guidance, it's referring to then documents that are outdated and need to be updated. Like that in and of itself is a problem and a weakness and an inherent threat. Because every time you have new guidance, you're forcing yourself to essentially like update all the other guidance. One of the things that we actually talked about was kind of referring to SOPs at like a site or at a sponsor level. And if your SOPs are referencing other documents like constantly, and you're referencing other material, and it's not just clear and specific and concise enough in that SOP or in that document, then you're setting yourself up to end up running into those conflicts and running into those issues. And as that general rule, they don't like seeing stuff like that. I know if there's an inspector or an auditor there and you just have documents referencing other documents and everything's all over the place, you're going to run into that issue to where things get missed and things get overlooked. But I digress. Moving on to the threats. DAP guidance is not diverse enough. The 4 main DAP categories: race, ethnicity, sex, and age. Although relevant, we don't feel is granular enough. We've talked a bunch about Directive 15 already, and kind of how that granularity looks on OMB standards. But even with OMB standards, outside of what those demographics and that information may look like, they don't include SES or your socioeconomic status information, as well as social determinants of health that may influence the safety and efficacy of products.
Perfect. So I would note you'll see a little bit of a difference on this SWOT versus some of the older ones, and that is the little objective at the bottom. So kind of like what we were saying, it's nice to attach a SWOT to an objective, and this is to achieve proportional and clinically relevant clinical enrollment for proper review of the safety, tolerability, and efficacy of tested medical product, of a tested medical product. So that's when you look at SWOT, that's what it's attached to. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this screen. We'll see if we can't bring on the next, and we'll figure out a better way to be more streamlined. I think there's a way to do this better. All right, welcome to guidance. Section number 5B, rationale for enrollment goals. Okay, we'll do an outline of what we're going to talk about. We're doing B and C. So enrollment goals, very, very short. It kind of gives you the list of what is expected to be on your diversity action plan. And then C, measures to meet enrollment goals. Admittedly, when I read, I thought that was a KPI at first. Like, what are you going to measure?
Right.
That's
Yeah.
not what this is. This is like the measures that you take to accomplish
Correct.
your objectives. So anyone who got confused with that, you weren't alone. But
when I first read this, that's kind of where my mind went to as well. But that was June 26th when the guidance came out, and everybody was kind of doing their initial read throughs, and I was like, oh well, this will be interesting. That said, I still ended up writing, and DiversiTrials, we had a whole article we ended up posting on LinkedIn on the 26th of June that just covered this whole section, and kind of those positive things and how we saw some alignment there already. So that was good.
Right.
So let's just start with B. Let's put C on another shelf because I think that's going to take a little longer, but let's just start with B. So Mitch and Hadi, how did you feel about it?
I think section B was straightforward, not as confusing as other sections, but the only confusing part that I personally felt that needed some more clarity is the paragraph starting with lines 343, 343 till 346. So they started saying, the industry or the sponsor can opt out of specific enrollment or out of specific enrollment goals if they're planning to conduct several clinical studies to support one single marketing submission, whereas the second, the following sentence says, a sponsor's rationale for having different enrollment goals across planned studies must be included in diversity action plans. For me personally, I thought it was a little contradicting. It can lead to some confusion with the reader. So I'm thinking here maybe a better clarity on how this can be drafted or rewritten that would probably be an advantage for the reader.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
They kind of touched on this in the previous section talking about this, but you're absolutely right, Hadi. It's kind of weird. And the sentence after that, the rationale should indicate how individual clinical studies are intended to contribute to overall enrollment goals. Again, I think this is another thing pointing at this is something that has to be done from the very beginning. If you're going to be talking about this isn't a phase 3 thing. This is a phase 0 thing.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, they're talking about the overall submissions, right? So we have to look at maybe that program from a ClinDev perspective, as opposed to an individual study that might just be this one study that you're taking this one significant pivotal study, and that's going to be used for your submission, right? Mm-hmm. Or do you have a program, platform? Right. Yeah.
So the other thing that I personally noticed is under the second paragraph, under additionally for drugs, going on, and between the parentheses on line 355, when they specified in the example by age, sex, or by genetic variation, which I thought was actually a good write-up. But I think it would be actually good to be a little consistent with table 1. So, I mean, under table 1, which we discussed last week, they listed race, ethnicity, sex, and age, which is all great. But I'd like to see more consistency across this guidance. If
terminology.
Right. If they specify genetic variation here, it would be good to specify it in table 1 and be consistent across all the guidance.
Yeah.
So I'm really glad you brought that one up, Hadi, because, and this is what got me, that genetic variance one. That's where where did they cite footnote number 55? Wherever that was.
Yeah, it was in the first bullet of additionally when it talks about drugs.
Yeah, drug metabolism. So the genetic variability was a direct reference into footnote 55. But what really got me about footnote 55 is look at the year.
Yeah, 2013.
It was over 11 years ago. And I read the guidance very briefly. And it's like literally the scientific version of what we're talking about now as far as underserved populations, diversity, metabolism. Even if you look on page 15 it's section number 3 of that guidance, and we won't go through it, but they even talked about this, how there will be a difference in metabolism of drug. But what's interesting is they did not use ethnicity. They used sex, age, and race, but they did not have ethnicity back in 2013.
Right.
So
right.
a little bit of a difference in time, but yeah, it was kind
Very
of
interesting, yeah.
An 11-year age gap's not all that bad, right?
but that's 11 years ago. FDA knew this was a thing, and we're not getting a guidance until 2024.
Right. Yeah.
It's
No,
like,
that's a
come
great
on, guys.
point. I mean, I get where you're coming from for sure. The only other thing I really want to add, I mean, because I agree with Hadi in general, this does seem to be a well-structured subsection and B. However, in that additionally section, when it talks about drugs, the only other thing that continues to hit me is kind of how we already looked at, like, okay, these are the studies that need to have DAP, and they talk about encouraging, strongly encouraging, I think was the word. FDA strongly encourages you to have, a comprehensive DAP program essentially for your entire clinical development process, including early phase, but it doesn't appear that they are requiring it at all.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting that when we get to talking again about the safety information, which was one of our initial concerns, is that, okay, you're not requiring it to collect PKs and PDs. Like, you're not requiring these in phase 1 to do this real early safety and tolerability data. So then, well, if this is a novel therapeutic, what are you basing this off of if you're not putting in the due diligence to collect these early phase in your study?
Mm-hmm.
And it almost kind of creates this allowance or exception for then, well, now sponsors just kind of need to come up with terminology and what they're going to use to satisfy these DAP requirements, instead of making sure it's like this more obligatory process that they have to collect the safety and efficacy data, as opposed to just deferring to, what current information we know, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
I had a couple of notes. We start off with the word must. So this is you guys got to do this. And they even use the word statutory. So now the FDA is saying this is a Congress thing. This isn't an FDA thing. Sorry, but you have to do this. No questions asked.
Right.
So they got really serious in the beginning with this. And then they gave you the grocery list. And so it's like, okay, well, we want background information. And here's your catch-all, any other background information. So you've got background. And then on top of that, we go into the multi-study thing, which seems kind of out of place if you really think about the organization of the ideas here. But
right.
So we've got this multi-market thing. And then they break it into additionally. So a couple of things. The bullet points are separated by drug versus device. That's pretty much the main separator. But the person in me that's maybe a little OCD doesn't like seeing an additionally with another additionally. So probably should have been another bullet point here. It's a different idea. It really doesn't belong in the same paragraph. Wordsmithing, right, Mitch? But you'll see a lot of similarities between the drugs and devices. The one that I thought was cool, and big shout out to Diane from a couple episodes ago, was at the very end where there was an example on the variations of skin pigmentation that may exist across diverse populations that can affect the performance of certain devices. So big kudos. Diane said that back then. So I'm really glad that FDA put an example in there.
That's a win here. However, I feel like when we were reviewing previous requirements for DAPs, there were a whole lot of exceptions for device studies. And that's why that actually came up to begin with, because this is a concern.
So that's, I mean, overall, I wouldn't expect this section to take too long. Maybe my only other gripe is I don't feel like this section added anything that we didn't already talk about. And I get it if it's repeated in the background introduction, because that's what's supposed to happen. But a lot of this stuff was in section 4. A lot of this stuff was in section 5A. I really don't feel like this added too much, except for a reminder that it's statutory, that this is pretty serious.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's a good call out. I mean, they did talk about initially that they touched on earlier in the guidance about the reporting requirements to Congress annually. So
Mhm.
that happens for a reason. They're not just doing it for fun.
Yeah.
Right.
So without further ado, if there are no other comments on section 5B, we can move on to 5C. I think that's the fun one. That's the one that we have some fun things about.
Yep.
Okay, so section 5C, general, this is measurements. In other words, the measures you would take to meet enrollment goals. This is the diversity action plan. They have some recommendations to sponsors on how they might be doing these diversity action plans. And then they also talk about the monitoring plan. So 422 to 429 is what I was referencing in the SWOT analysis, and we'll get there. I don't want to cut ahead, but one thing I did really want to start out with, FDA reined us all in, right? They're over here saying, I know this is going to get shredded. So they're like, well, FDA recognizes that there are certain disparities in healthcare systems. This is what this guidance is going to cover. So we acknowledge it as truth, but let's stay within scope here, everyone. And so I'm glad that they ended up putting that there.
Yeah. And then
Overall impressions,
the
Mitch
last,
Hottie, you want to take turn?
sentence of that too, of that first big paragraph, it's great because FDA encourages sponsors to consult patients and healthcare providers, and they get a little bit more detailed later on with how some of those partnerships should work in that first bullet point. But yeah, I mean, it should be beyond just healthcare providers. Healthcare providers are great. You know, everybody consults like KOLs, but you know, there should be, we've seen a lot in the industry, an uptick or increasing trend in engaging patients or patient advocate groups significantly more than we did, you know, even a decade ago. So
Right.
it's
So to your
positive.
point, Mitch, that was actually one of my take that, you know, I would have loved to see a little more details on how they can actually get the patients involved.
Right.
Some kind of a guideline, some kind of a, you know, whatever recommendation, whatever you want to call it, like, you know, on how you can actually really encourage, you know, the industry or the sponsor to really get those patients involved, whether with advocacy groups, whether with, like, you know, the getting them involved in the design early on. Whatever the case may be, I would have loved to see more attention given to the patient under this section.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if I'm jumping away, but my other jumping ahead. But my other thing, real quick, is when they listed the how you can actually improve enrollment is by employing clinical study decentralization when appropriate, and that's on line 421, which I like, but I would have loved again to see more details on the strengths and weaknesses, or a little debate on what DCT can bring in terms of, you know, weaknesses and strengths to this section. These were my two big takeaways. But again, I love the term retention. Enrollment and retention and monitoring. I like the way they specify that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only other thing where most of these bullet points, we'll jump into them a little bit more, but the first bullet point, I guess, since that's where we're going to be starting anyways, implementing sustained community engagement. Now, I don't know exactly how they mean this. When most people talk about community engagement and outreach, it's coming from the site level, right? It's not generally, not to say that, you know, sponsors and CROs aren't doing things for the community and in the communities. Like I saw them at Cincinnati, you know, Flying Pig Marathon when I was there with my daughter earlier this year. But in general, you know, it just felt like that almost kind of broaches on like what those expectations are in developing a diversity action plan as far as sustained community engagement, when I think sites are going to be looking at it from that expectation of like, they have to do the community engagement. They're the ones engaging the community constantly. So, you know, looking towards enrollment strategies and enrollment tactics, if you're not engaging your sites and finding out those tricks of the trade and what it is that they're doing to engage with communities in a sustained fashion to develop like that comprehensive patient pool or population. I think that might be a little bit of a miss with the DAPS, but community engagement isn't something that specifically sounds like a sponsor is going to have oversight of.
So
Like a sponsor can't enforce a site to, oh, you have to do this, right?
so and you know, I mean, I can talk about this for a long time. I know engagement, like community engagement, is a universal kind of terminology which is adopted in the industry. I personally believe, and I mean, coming from community fairs and community events and community engagement, if you want to put it this way, people feel a little intimidated and abused by the term community engagement, and this is just a kind suggestion to the industry and FDA and sponsors if we can just look into another terminology than engagement. Engagement seems a little transactional to communities because we go in and out without even building this long-term trust. So I would suggest we call it sustained community trust building instead of engagement, because engagement has some negative connotation with some communities. That's what I wanted to share.
I do give them kudos though for throwing sustained in there because that's the concept. I mean, even when I talk about it, I usually just use the term like unconditional community engagement, right? That's my whole thing, is being there. It doesn't matter. Like, I'm not just trying to have a transactional relationship with you, and that's what they're getting at here. So it really does kind of align a lot with our core principles and values as DiversiTrials in general, though. So that's great.
So line number 412 just killed the entire section for me.
Nice. Oh, well, before we get to 412.
Oh, go ahead. I want Mitch to go first because I got
ones. Yeah. So the second bullet point, so glad to see that, because cultural competency training and proficiency training is something that we heavily push. Dr. Danawi is huge on cultural competency training. That's like one of the core requirements of even like having like a partnership or an agreement with DiversiTrials in general, is that's something that we're ensuring that we always are bringing to the table with sites. So when we, are going to do outreach or talk to people, there's a lot of alignment again that I saw in this section, because that's like, yep, we couldn't agree more, because that's something that we have as a mandatory expectation and requirement. And when we engage with sites and we're going to talk with sites about, things that we recommend and we encourage that they do, this is one of those key things on the list always.
Let's do all the bullet points and then I'll come back to it. So go ahead, Mitch, you're doing great. What's the next bullet point? Explain it.
Yeah. So as far as participant awareness and knowledge of the study, I mean, you get ads on daytime talk shows a lot of times. I know I used to see them all the time. Like, we joke about them, like, oh, they come on during Maury because those are the patients that are going to be home and able to have time to go to the site to participate in your trial. But I mean, this is good in general. I think most programs are already doing this. You're trying to make participants aware, but I think the key takeaway here to me is that example, right? It's providing language assistance for persons with limited English proficiency. So it's exploring those additional opportunities to engage, a diverse and inclusive population for your study. It's not just your standard awareness stuff, your standard social media things. It's going the extra mile when you're hitting bullet point 1 and you're engaging community advisors and working in patient advocate groups. Like, you're actually like embracing and learning and acknowledging the different ways that people are going to receive this information and how they're going to receive that information. And those are the things that you need to take into consideration with that bullet point as far as participant awareness and knowledge. But we're huge advocates of constant education and awareness. And, not to specifically plug like Diverse Research Now, but that's their whole thing. We have a partnership with Diverse Research Now, and they're a nonprofit that solely focuses on kind of that hand-holding process with patients and educating them on what clinical trials look like as a whole. They're not trying to get patients specifically on any study. They're not taking that transactional approach. Their whole purpose is just to build those relationships with patients and help support them with getting through clinical trials and providing that knowledge and combating, research misinformation and everything as well. So it's huge. And you can hit burden if you want, unless Heidi's got something to add here.
No, go ahead. So there's a bullet point on reducing participant burden. And admittedly, I sat here thinking, why is this just for diversity? Why can't we just do this universally? I don't understand why this is something just because they were talking about providing transportation assistance, providing dependent care, allowing flexible hours. It's like, that should just be a participant.
So yeah. I mean, I totally agree with that, and I love that they have suggestions. I did kind of chuckle when it talked about providing transportation assistance because a few months ago, there was an article that came out regarding like it was like an NIH funded trial, and it was like their initiatives, or the only thing that they did essentially to try to include a more diverse population was just providing transportation assistance for like essentially the justification that, well, they can't afford transportation and they don't have cars, or they can't afford transportation to participate in trials. So if we pay for the transportation, that's gonna help us enroll a more diverse population. And it was just remarkably insulting to read. Like how many people had to like sign off and approve that's your approach, and this is like your justification for trying to increase your enrollment. Surely that's the only problem these people have and face, and they're all poor. You know what I mean? It's like, what are you saying? Like, this is wild.
I sat here like a sponsor thinking, okay, these are interesting pieces of advice. Who else is paying for this? FDA is not paying for this. I'm paying for this. So I know that transportation and the costs incurred as a reimbursement, they're big. A lot of money goes into that, and sponsors have to pay a lot of money. So yeah, it's an interesting recommendation. And then finally, just as Hadi was saying, so improving access to clinical study by limiting clinical study exclusion criterion, selecting clinical site locations that would facilitate enrollment, healthcare integration, research deserts. Sounds good to me. And considering the accessibility needs for persons with disabilities. Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Finally, last bullet point. I'm just going to call it the MedVector bullet point because that's pretty much what I think of when I read it. That guidance, the little footnote says something pretty cool. I'm looking forward to it. When final, this guidance will represent the FDA's current thinking on the topic. That's kind of boilerplate. They do that with every draft, but decentralized is coming, everyone. And I'm so glad that they were able to put that in the diversity section.
Yeah, that should be right around the corner, really, anytime.
So I want to play a quick exercise because this is something that is that okay, Mitch? Are you done? Or
well, yeah, I think just one more thing on the improving access aspect or reducing patient burden really is when they talk about avoiding unnecessary study-related procedures. Like to your point, Fox, it's like, yeah,
can't that just happen for everyone? Why
this shouldn't be specific? I mean, that's something that we talk about all the time with literally every study. You know,
the same goes for the exclusion criteria. I mean,
yeah, why would diversity have anything to do with that? That should just be something for our participants.
Well, to me too. I mean, that's expanded access like all over it. You know, it's like, well, let's slim this down to make it as inclusive as possible, and not, you know, over restrict and overdo it on our inclusion exclusion criteria. But
so, quick question: how many exclusion criteria did you see the most in any protocol?
Oh man, I don't know. I
remember a 30-page one.
Yeah.
Of just exclusion criteria?
Yeah, I mean,
what was the size of that font?
I mean, it gets pretty ridiculous. So anyway, yeah, I mean,
I think about like 47. That's probably some of the highest.
I heard 57. I heard someone saying 57. It's like, okay.
Trying to find a needle in a stack of needles, man.
Exactly. But anyway,
crazy.
Yeah.
All right. If it's okay, for the third attempt, I'll try to do this exercise. So line number 412 just did it for me. One of the recommendations to reduce participant burden was the term employing sites for procedures and laboratory tests that are convenient to specific populations. This here tells me the individual or individuals writing this section have no idea what they're talking about.
Right.
And here's the reason why. Every CTA I've ever read says that sites are, you guessed it, my favorite words, independent contractors, and are not employees of the sponsor, right? So maybe it's wordsmithing. I don't care what it is, but given the recommendations in these bullet points, I think that there is some confusion on the ethical boundaries and legal boundaries between what a sponsor should and is entitled to do, given the fact that they are coming to an independent contractor to seek services, and what sites as independent contractors are offering to the sponsors. And so the exercise that I wanted to do is I wanted to go back through these bullet points. I wanted to ask each of you, whose responsibility is this? Is this the site's responsibility? Is this something that the site controls, or is this something the sponsor can actually do about it? So let's start at the top. Implementing sustained community engagement through community advisory boards and navigators, community health workers, patient advisory groups, local healthcare providers, or community organizations. Do you think that's a sponsor thing, or should it be a site thing?
Well, that was kind of my point when I first was addressing it, because I agree that language is a little bit confusing, because community engagement as an industry term is normally something that's looked at as like a site responsibility and what you're doing constantly. However, what I think the intention here is, and what they're looking for, is that aspect of their sustained community engagement is constantly be communicating with your patient advocate groups for your TAs, right? Especially if you're like in rare disease. If you're not engaging with your patient advocacy groups, what are you doing? Mm-hmm. But constantly engaging in, those KOL physicians, constantly engaging with community organizations, whether it's like religious leaders or whatever it may be, to make sure that you are building as quality DAP as possible. So I think what they mean is this is a sponsor obligation, and that's how it should be written, for sure.
So I have a different take on that. I think it's the site's responsibility, but should be funded by the sponsor.
Funded, but they shouldn't have their hands in it.
No. It should be definitely 100% funded by the sponsor, but they should delegate this to the site, because they know exactly how their community works. They know exactly who is in their community, and they know how to work it out.
Right.
It should be 100% if I'm a sponsor coming to select a site, one of the on my feasibility study, I should probably look at how are you going to engage or have a sustainable engagement, sustainable community trust building relationship. What are the criteria? What are your programs? So I would probably take this into consideration and try with my site selection. It should be delegated to the site, but 100% funded by the sponsor. Mm-hmm. And this is one thing that we have to actually work through. And this is what one of my plans with the congressional upcoming meeting, that I have to actually sponsor, or at least come up with some action items on a state level, whereby we can not enforce, but at least have something, at least sponsor a bill, at the state level, whereby sponsors can or should fund community programs, period.
So I think with that, there's only like a little bit of a difference or delineation there, because again, I feel like I might need to get an ICH E8 quality by design tattoo, because I've been saying it like every single week this entire year. That's where this comes into play. And a sponsor should be engaging a multitude of clinical research sites. You should have, not just like key physicians that you're engaging with, but you should also have like key coordinators that you use that review, the protocols and things like that as you're developing them. So hopefully those sites that you're engaging have these systems in place, and they are doing all this work with, their sustained community engagement practices, because then they can give you better feedback and better information while you're designing your study in your clinical program. But that's the only difference to me. Like, I don't necessarily think that this is every site, because there's a lot that this might not be. It also kind of depends on, it's going to depend a little bit on like the TA. It's going to depend on, if it's a physician run study where you're just kind of going to be doing this at your university hospital, or is this going to be like a global program? So I think the FDA also has to kind of fit everyone into one guidance. So that's why I'm still sticking with sponsor, but I love where your head's at. And I think it's absolutely pertinent that, sponsors should help be able to encourage that continuous community engagement or the unconditional community engagement, like I'm talking about. That would be great, because that's the same thing as, patient engagement and outreach, which sponsors are paying for. They're paying you they're paying other recruiting companies. They're paying for all these services already. So if you just do it in a more intentional way, continuously, then maybe you have to spend less on, funneling 47,000 patients through your platform to get like one ultimately enrolled in a trial when it funnels down.
So I did want to point out a couple words right before these bullet points, and they have a lot to do with my opinions on some of these. But the terms enrollment and retention they're used a couple times. But in terms of enrollment, what sites are literally being hired to do, and retention, in other words, the relationships you build with patients to keep them on a trial, those are two very ethically bound responsibilities of the clinical research site that, in my humble opinion, sponsors should not be a part of for
Correct.
certain ethical reasons.
Correct.
Which also tells me, maybe wordsmithing, but I'm not sure if those are the right objectives that we should be giving sponsors in a guidance. With that said, the first bullet point, I think the examples they used are very good opportunities for sponsors to show that they are listening to things. For example, advisory boards and navigators, health workers. These are all ways to interview the front lines to understand how you can develop the protocol better, maybe how you can do perspective. But on Hadi's side, the community engagement that's sustained is not a sponsor responsibility when it comes to enrollment and retention, which is what this entire section was prefaced off of.
Right.
So I think that the bullet point is sponsor based, but its location in the document under enrollment and retention is out of place, and that's a site thing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a site thing at that larger level. And that kind of takes me back to my comment about like the FDA having to write these in a generic way enough to include all these clinical studies, because there are some small sponsor trials where, if you're just an investigator initiated trial, this is also going to be you. You have to come up with an enrollment and retention strategy on your own, at your facility potentially, and that's all you're going to enroll on. So
what do you think about the next bullet point, the one that we all agreed on, but is that a sponsor responsibility?
I mean, I would love to see it, but I know a lot of sites would push back on it.
So do you see that like they would have to take a diversity and cultural competency training as a mandatory training to be a part of a trial?
Right. I mean, that's like instead of just showing someone like a GCP certificate, it's another training that's added on every single trial you potentially start, or maybe at least like with one sponsor, if they have a way to, like using a Longboat platform, for example, like, okay, maybe you can take this training in here and it'll stay in the training for you specifically across the rest of their studies in that platform. But
that's a good point, Mitch. What if you just included this as a component of GCP?
I mean, that would be great. We updating GCP now?
It was just updated in 2023, but
right.
That would be a good home for it. I see it as like ISO 9000, right? ISO 9000 is an accreditation. It makes sites more competitive, but very rarely is it a requirement of a study.
Right. So the only thing about the only thing I'll add about cultural competency training from my perspective, and Hadi, I would love to hear maybe a little bit more if you agree or disagree, or what your thoughts are, because I mean, you're a chief diversity officer here, not me. But as far as cultural competency training, like there should be general guidance and general information on how you are open, to receiving different perspectives and insights, and understand that there are differences in different communities, ethnically, religiously, et cetera. And you should be open to those and understanding to those. But I think the only thing a little bit different from my approach from like a site support organization is what that cultural competency training might look like for us is going to be a little bit more granular, a little bit more specific, depending on the communities that we're actually engaging with as well.
So yes, Mitch, I agree with you in terms of the cultural competency. I believe it should be, again, the same scenario, delegated to the site, but funded by, the sponsor, and it should be one of the checkboxes that I have to actually sign off on with the site selection. That's basically what I think personally, my personal humble opinion, as maybe Dr. Fox said. But yeah, this is basically it. It should be really one of the checkboxes.
So I'm kind of like on that whole, this is kind of like telling an independent contractor what tool to use. I don't think it's legally bound. I don't think that the sponsors have a legal right to it. But to make it comprehensive, I would change the first word providing to offering. That way it's an option.
I think the only thing I'll throw in there too is, maybe not, they don't have like a legal ability to enforce that. However, sponsors and then generally like subcontracted to the CROs, right? Sponsors are ultimately responsible for selecting sites that are qualified.
But that's another bullet point.
Are qualified to conduct clinical trials, right?
Yeah.
They make sure that they're qualified. And if
so I think this is actually something that could be baked into a site SOP, like other things.
Sure.
In other words, it's a site controlled thing. But I'd love to see sponsors offer that to sites who are willing to take it. But again, I don't know. I think FDA is kind of muddying what.
Right. So this is a little bit different, right? So the sponsor it is their responsibility to make sure that they're selecting those sites that meet all the little check boxes that they have. And if this is one of their check boxes, they don't have to work with those sites that don't want to do it.
It's kind of like, so it's selection.
You get on the SIP bandwagon or you don't. And if you don't get on it, then you're not going to work with us. Mm-hmm. But it's a similar concept with providing cultural competency training and proficiency training is, this is something that we're going to require moving forward to be a part of our clinical program. And maybe you only have to do it every so often, or I don't know how they want to keep track of it. But
it could probably go in a couple of different ways. It could go sponsor or site, depending on how things are going.
This should be an item in the budget. That should be negotiated.
Yeah. Good luck with that, Hadi. Go through a couple negotiations. You tell me.
On sponsors,
I have included diversity action plan and diversity planning and diversity community outreach in every single contract budget that I do now.
You're right.
It is never approved.
I know, and this is what we need to say. This is what we need to say, that this has to be highlighted and emphasized, that sponsors should fund these trainings and these culturally competent, and proficiency trainings and others. That should be something that we need to propose.
So 53 minutes in, this was never going to take the whole hour, right? All right, a few more bullet points. Improving study participant awareness and knowledge of the clinical study. E.g.
That's a shared responsibility for sure.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Informed consent, that's a sponsor funded thing. Funding for the coordinators who can communicate, that's a site thing.
Yeah, local campaigns versus central campaigns, as far as I get.
But it's the ICF. I love the exclusion criteria being have to speak English.
Yeah, exactly.
It's terrible, but it's a thing. Reducing participant burden, avoiding anyway, so if we wanted to do this for enrollment and retention, whose responsibility would it be to reduce participant burden?
So the way this is meant and should be viewed is as those sponsor responsibilities and things that they can do during that design process, right? Your quality by design, things that the sponsor can do proactively, like a QA aspect, if you will, quality assurance, to make sure that those patients are going to be able to stay in the study and make sure that the access is available. It's just the QA mindset that goes into your quality by design for a trial. But let's be honest, like there's a whole ton of work that sites are putting in to make sure that that access to studies are good for patients. There's a lot of times it's like, okay, well, look, we can't access, this platform's down, whatever. Like I'll pay for them to get an Uber myself. You know, I don't care. We'll figure it out later, or we won't figure it out. Like,
Hadi, what do you think? I think he's reading.
I have mixed feelings, but I agree with Mitch. I mean, it's the way it's written. It's a little funny.
Yeah,
I think it makes sense. Write the protocol differently and pay for it. That's kind of what I got out of that, and it makes a lot of sense. I can see that as being a sponsor responsibility.
Yep. This last one has your favorite word, employing.
Again.
So, as far as decentralization, to me,
I think we missed one.
Always. Did we?
Improving access to clinical studies by limiting clinical study exclusion criterion.
Yeah,
Here's your selection. Selecting clinical study site locations that would facilitate enrollment of a representative study population.
Right.
That's a selection. That's all sponsored.
Responsibility. Yeah, for sure.
That's all sponsored.
But this last one, as far as decentralization, that looks very different a lot of times, right? So you have options for decentralization that are built into a clinical program. So you can work with a home health agency. That's an aspect of decentralization, right? But the responsibility still falls on that individual site investigator. So it still falls on your PI. So your PI is the one and your site that ultimately has to make that decision of, we want to work with this home health agency, or yes, we want to work and use this tool, essentially, because that's all decentralization is to me, is a set of tools to create better accessibility or make, or lessen the burden on patients. So it's a little bit of a mix of both, because the sponsor has to be able to be receptive of those decentralization options. But I don't think it should necessarily always have to come from top down, right? They're not going to say, we're only going to work with Markin and you can go with them for home health, because if a site already has an established relationship with a quality home health agency, maybe it's a local group, that really reliable and they do well together, they're trained, then why not let them work with that decentralized option that works best for them? So you should be a little bit flexible.
I agree completely. By employ, I would change that word to offering. Going back to home health, sponsors and CROs may have preferred vendors for home health or whatever it might be, but on a legal and a regulatory level, it is the site's responsibility to employ that activity.
Yeah,
and it depends on the community as well. I mean, it's a bespoke approach too. I mean, this DCT might work for this community. This DCT might not work.
It's got to be bespoke. So, Which means it's got to come from the local site, the site who knows their community. That's got to be what happens.
Exactly.
All right, so we're so one more. This 422 to 429. This is pretty much telling us that the DAP is fluid. So it says sponsor at the very last sentence. Sponsors can also provide this information in submissions for diversity action plan modifications and in briefing packages. So don't expect a one and done DAP. The DAP is a fluid and living document. It will be changing, and the FDA does expect these modifications to happen as they go, which also means that by the time you have phase 3, you'll have a few modifications, is my hope.
Well, I mean, we talked about that last time as far as plans, especially if it's a multi-study plan that you're ultimately developing. You should be making plans, because the whole process, you should be constantly evaluating and having some sort of metrics to see, how you're doing to meet your DAP initiatives, right? And if something's not working, you need to change it up. You need to try something else. Maybe you need to do a little bit more than just pay for Uber
transportation.
You know what I mean? Yeah, like maybe we need to revisit it and see how we can do better.
Mm-hmm. So that was it. I mean, too short set. How did you have something else?
No, I just wanted to say that this became more evident that it's a fluid document as opposed to what we discussed last week.
Yeah.
So
and I'm so glad that was answered. I'm glad they put that in there. We just had to wait a little bit longer. We had to be patient.
Right.
We need to understand the whole story.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
No, I think we've had a wonderful discussion, and these are very, very important points that we raised.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No new comments in the PDF, in the shared PDF. So that wraps this session, and we'll work on getting a SWOT out probably by Thursday, hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully we'll get a SWOT out. We'll have it to present, discuss. Please get your comments in here if you want to be a part of it. I know it's a little bit impromptu, but it took a whole other hour to get through these 2 sections. So that's good to go.
Yep.
So
And
any last words?
Friday is section 6 and 7. 7's a lengthy one as well. So 6 is crazy short. We're gonna blast through 6, and then we'll see how much we can get through section 7. To be honest,
Don't be intimidated. It's a lot of duplicity because they have a whole section on devices that's the exact same thing.
Yep.
So
yep,
it's not too bad.
absolutely. All right.
Well,
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you
Everyone,
so
we'll see you
much.
Friday.
See you. Bye.
Bye now.